Kia ora koutou, ko Natasha aho. Good evening, everyone. I'm Natasha, and I am here this evening to tell you the secret to life. So I'm giving it away a little bit in the title of my talk this evening, but if you didn't know already, I did my PhD research on belongingness, specifically belongingness in the context of organizations. So over the course of 4 years, I spent hundreds of hours in conversation with people about belongingness. And I talked to people here in New Zealand, as well as in the US, at all different levels of organizations, organizations big and small, all the way from frontline staff to seasoned executives who are near the end of their career. And there was a very common thread that I found in having these conversations, which is that when it comes to stories about belonging, everybody has one, a story of belonging or not belonging. And they tend to be the kinds of stories that leave long-lasting imprints on our hearts and minds. So I thought I would start off by actually telling you a little bit about my story of belonging before we get into the juicy science. So I grew up in the northern part of the US, up near the Canadian border in what we call the heartland of America. Grew up on a farm there, and I feel like this picture probably tells you a whole lot more about my upbringing than I could actually describe in words. So the dinner table talk when I was growing up was often about wheat yields and crop rotation and who bought a brand new pickup truck, and of course, always the weather. Meanwhile, as a kid, I was a reader, a thinker, a dreamer, and I spent every spare second I could with my nose in a book and occasionally writing some pretty terrible poetry. So you can imagine there wasn't always a whole lot of common ground between me with my head in the clouds and these fine folks who had their hands in the dirt. So as soon as I graduated high school, I leapt into big city life and moved across the country. I got a few college degrees, university degrees, as they say here, climbed up the corporate ladder and learned quite a lot about myself along the way. Fast forward a couple decades, and here I am in a whole nother country, another hemisphere, another continent. And nowadays, when I go back home to North Dakota, there are a lot of things that still feel the same. The dinner table talk is still the same. I still am a reader, a thinker, and a dreamer who occasionally writes terrible poetry. But there have also been some things that have shifted, and it feels like there's been a bit of a softening and a moving towards belonging. As an example, the last time that I was home, my mom gave me a sheet of paper and she said, "Can you just write down what exactly it is that you do?" And then she proceeded to put it up on her fridge so that the next time people asked her, she would know what to tell them. There's a really beautiful quote by Atul Gawande, and he says, "Curiosity is the beginning of empathy." And I like to think that curiosity is also the beginning of belonging. So here's a little overview of the journey towards belongingness that we'll take today. So first, we'll talk a little bit about what belongingness is. So how do we define belongingness in the research? Why should we care about belongingness? There's some really compelling literature that talks about what it is that we're up against in today's society that makes belongingness more important than ever before. And then what do we do with all of that information? What's our call to action? So what's the backdrop of belonging? What are we talking about when we talk about belongingness? So back in 1995, there were a couple of researchers, Baumeister and Leary, who created the theory of belongingness. And essentially that theory says that nothing matters more to us than belongingness. From an evolutionary psychology point of view, our very survival depended on belonging, being part of a group. And you fast forward to now, it matters just as much. If you look at the neuroscience behind belonging or being in an out group, we have the same reaction to being perceived as an outsider as we would if we were in physical pain. So all of the evolution that has happened in those centuries has actually not made its way to our brain. So we still feel like there is nothing more important to us than belonging. So if we look at how we actually define belongingness in the research, Baumeister and Leary said that belongingness is a pervasive drive to form and maintain a minimum quantity of lasting, positive, and significant interpersonal relationships. So since 1995, when they created the theory of belongingness, lots of other researchers have hopped on the belongingness bandwagon, myself included, and come up with a few other segments of belongingness that are really critical to our overall well-being. So some of those are perceived social support, social connection frequency, and being in a meaningful group. So if you want to kind of test your own belongingness barometer, you can ask yourself things like, do I have 2 or 3 people that I could call at 3 a.m. if I was really in trouble? Do I regularly interact with other people in a meaningful way? And am I part of a group where it feels like there's mutual care and understanding? So that gives us a little bit of the foundation for what belongingness is, and when we use the term belongingness, what it is that we're actually talking about. Now we'll get into what I think is some really compelling research around why belongingness actually is so critical. So many of you have probably heard the term loneliness epidemic. It's been around for a couple decades now. And what I find really interesting about this term is it was coined by social psychologists, but it wasn't just a fun phrase to throw around. There's actually some really compelling literature that sits behind why we're in a loneliness epidemic. So one of those factors, and I find this to be a pretty startling fact, is that there are more people living alone now than at any other point in human history. So probably not entirely surprising when we think about the Industrial Revolution and all of the ways that our society has slowly become more and more individualistic. But that fact to me is quite a startling standalone piece of information. Adding on to this, the other factor is when we look at the people that we can call at 3 a.m., as I mentioned on that previous slide, we've seen a steady decline in that number over time. So in 1985, the average American, this is based on research that was done in the US, the average American had 3 people that they thought they could make that 3 a.m. phone call to. Ever since 1985, that number has been steadily declining. So now it's somewhere between 1 and 2. But perhaps more sobering than that is that as of 2004, 25% of Americans, 1 in 4 Americans, said they had no one that they could lean on for that social support, no one that they could turn to for that 3 a.m. phone call. So when we talk about the loneliness epidemic, those are some of the things that are making up that terminology. The next piece is around physiological impact. And I know when I first started studying belongingness and its counterpart, loneliness, the physiological piece was really surprising to me. So I think the mental health side of things, which I'll talk about next, makes intuitive sense. We know that there would be an impact there that comes from loneliness and social isolation. But in terms of the physiological impact, what we've been able to see quite clearly from the research now is that there is a real detrimental effect on our health if we identify as lonely. So things like blood pressure, sleep, even premature death have been linked to identifying as feeling lonely and being socially isolated. There's also a kind of fun fact or not so fun fact that many of you may have heard, which is that if you identify as lonely, it has the same impact on your health as smoking 15 cigarettes per day. So we're not just talking about, airy-fairy, wouldn't it be nice if we all had a sense of belonging, but these are real things that have an impact on our physiological health as well. And then, of course, there's the mental health piece. And this is, as I mentioned, a bit more intuitive, not surprising, right? So not having a sense of belonging or identifying as lonely is linked to things like depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. So those are some of the more serious factors around why belongingness matters. But we also know there's some other kind of ancillary areas that are impacted by belongingness or not having a sense of belonging. So things like well-being, creativity, productivity, and in the workplace, engagement. So I'm going to use that as just a brief kind of detour to talk about engagement in the workplace and how belongingness comes into play there. So it may surprise you to know that the number one factor in employee engagement is, do you have a friend at work? or maybe it's not surprising to you if you have personal experience with this. And I know this came up really clearly in my own research as I was talking to people about their experiences of belongingness at work, that the relational capital that they had in the workplace had huge impacts on their motivation to show up, to be loyal to their workplace, to do good work. So you think about all the other factors that go into employee engagement, things like pay and benefits, even meaning and purpose, and how an organization is structured. All of those things matter less than if you have a friend at work, and the other piece is, do you have a positive relationship with your manager? So relationships trump everything when it comes to how engaged people are at work. And I'm sure if I had the privilege of having a conversation with every single one of you in this room, you probably all have your own stories of those relational aspects of work that have either been pretty terrible or in some cases pretty amazing and may have kept you where you are. So this is just a really quick snippet because I want to keep the sort of arc of the story tonight about belongingness as a whole. But as I mentioned at the beginning, my research was specifically around belongingness in organizations. And so this was just a quick glimpse at some of the findings of my research around belongingness culture. So there were three key kind of filtering questions that people tend to ask themselves when they're trying to identify, is this an organization where I belong? Those questions are, can I be me? Do you see me? And can I be me with you? So there's lots more that sits underneath here, and if you want to talk more about belongingness culture in the workplace, get in touch. All right, so I want to bring things back to this kind of overall story about why belongingness and why relationships matter. So we talked about that number one factor of engagement at work, the number one factor in overall health, well-being, and longevity. Surprise, surprise, the quality of your relationships. So some of you have maybe heard of the Harvard study of adult human development. It's the longest running study on adult well-being and development that's been running for over 80 years now. And they've been following hundreds of people and basically identifying what is it that differentiates those who have a long, happy, healthy life from those who don't. And so the really clear outcome of that study that continues to go on today is that high-quality relationships help us live longer, happier, healthier lives. And so when we look at factors like physical health, socioeconomic status, again, all of those things actually take a back seat and to some degree can be mitigated by the quality of relationships that we have. And I think we also see this in what's becoming quite popular now, which is the research around the blue zones. So those zones around the world where people tend to live longer and happier lives. So they have longer lifespan as well as longer health span. And those are finding similar things. So they're looking at things like diet and environmental factors as well. But the social aspect of that is a huge factor in the blue zone. So that sense of community, belonging, and valuing interpersonal connection is a key feature in those blue zones. So when we look across all of those different segments of research, there's this real common theme that relationships matter more than anything. All right, so what's the answer? I've painted a bit of a dismal picture about the impact of loneliness and social isolation and hopefully convinced you of the importance of having a sense of belonging and cultivating those personal relationships. So what do? What are some of the strategies for belonging? So here's 5 different takeaways that you can kind of use as your rules for the road. So the first one is talk to strangers. And this is actually evidence-backed. And for those of you in the room who are introverts, I am one. When I first read this, I didn't want to believe it, but it's true, and this study has actually been replicated. So the original study around talking to strangers took a group and essentially gave them the assignment of talking to strangers, just making small talk as they went about their day. And the results were quite resounding in their findings. So they found that mood, sense of well-being, sense of belonging, all of those well-being factors increased when people made the effort to talk to strangers. And we've seen other research since then about the positive impacts of small talk. So even if it sounds like that might be your worst nightmare, it's actually good for you. So take this as your cue, whether it's when you're standing in the supermarket checkout line or maybe even here tonight, to have a conversation with a stranger. The next two, have deeper conversations and be yourself, really center around getting into those meaningful spaces where we start to actually cultivate a sense of trust and real connection. Many of you are probably familiar with the work of Brené Brown. She's one of my research heroes, has lots of incredible books, and her work is really founded on this idea that vulnerability and entering into those spaces with people serve as the foundation for really building trust and sturdy relationships. The next one is be there, like really there. And so this one has to do with showing up for people. We've probably all heard the phrase, 80% of life is just showing up. And there is some science behind this as well. So that Harvard study of adult human development that I mentioned talked about longevity and consistency being two of the key ingredients when it came to building those high quality relationships. So that means, showing up for people when they're going through a tough time, even if it's in the smallest way possible. And it's also about being present in the little everyday moments. We all know how tough it is sometimes to put the phone down and actually engage with someone, but it has a huge impact on the overall quality of our relationships. And lastly, go first. Make the call, send the text, initiate the hug. So be the one who doesn't wait for someone else to take the first step, whether that is initiating a conversation with someone or getting into the good stuff with people that you already know. I want to end with one of my favorite quotes by the author J.D. McClatchy, who said that love is the quality of attention that we pay to things. And I hope I've given you sufficient evidence now to convince you to talk to strangers, call your mother, and love your friends, because your life depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And we'll now take questions. And I have a microphone if you have questions.
Hello. My question is, I'm wondering how your research or the research on belonging might differ for different types of neurodivergence, like autism, for example.
Yeah, great question. So I didn't specifically look into neurodiversity as part of my study, but one of the findings that I showed briefly in that slide was around, can I be me? And so that piece of the research came through really clearly that authenticity is a key part of what allows people to feel like they belong. And there's quite a growing body of research around authenticity at work and how critical that is, not just for belonging, but for some of the positive side effects of belonging, like creativity, like engagement, like good organizational citizenship, those kinds of things. The other thing that I think becomes really important when we talk about authenticity is having that sense of being recognized for what's important to you. So one of the other what to me felt like quite an interesting finding was that when it came to how people were recognized, they didn't want to be recognized for just, what someone else thought was unique about them. So for example, if I think that, I've got really good people skills and I'm great at getting people into good conversations, but the things that I'm recognized for by my manager or my peers or the organization as a whole have to do with my analytical skills or things like that, it's going to be less meaningful than if I'm recognized for the things that I value about myself. So some of those themes around authenticity and being recognized for what matters to us really become important when we're talking about belonging at work. Thank you.
Hi. What do you think about remote working?
Great question. Yeah, it's such a hot topic right now, and it's very tricky because on the one hand, we see from the research that things like small talk at work actually matter quite a lot. That was one of the recommendations in my own research, is that organizations do as much as they can to provide those organic opportunities for people to be engaging in, water cooler conversation, not work talk, but just the little, hey, how was your weekend? How was that hike you went on? Those little things. They seem like often meaningless in the grander scheme of things, but what we know from the the research is that they actually are the building blocks of building that cohesion for a team or within a particular workplace relationship. So I think that is really critical. I also, one thing I didn't mention about my own research is that it unintentionally was a pre and post COVID study. So I did my first round of interviews before COVID and the second round of interviews after COVID. And one of the things that people talked about was how they lost some of those touch points as a result of being sent to remote work. And at the same time, there were also examples of where when organizations did remote work really well, it actually made people feel like they did have more of a sense of belonging. As an example, people who were already teleworking or remotely working before COVID, all of a sudden, hey, everybody else understands, and I'm part of a team now. So much of how well remote working, how well it does, depends on how the manager handles it. And not to completely digress into the research around this as a whole, but when it comes to the kind of locus of belonging, where do people feel that sense of belonging? It's not to an organization, it's to the team. And so my advice to organizations who are thinking about and grappling with this remote work piece is remote working is okay, just make sure that the leaders of your teams are really well equipped to maintain that cohesion and that you still have opportunities for organic connection and conversation within that. Thank you. Yes?
Can you expand more on those 3 circles about the, I can be me, unseen to be me and stuff?
Yes. Yeah, I'll zip back to those real quick, just so we've got them as the backdrop. So this actually led into a much larger belongingness model in terms of what it is that contributes to belongingness, and also looking at the question of, is there such a thing as a dark side of belongingness, or can we have too much belongingness, which there is such a thing, but that's a story for another day. So these 3 pieces, this first one, the unveiled self, and it might be a bit too small, but I've got some kind of hallmark quotes up there that represent each of these 3 areas. So the unveiled self is really around that piece of authenticity. So can I show up as who I really am? And that looks different for different people. For some, it was about, I've got kind of a quirky sense of humor. Do people at work, respond to that? Do I feel like I can bring that to work? For some people, it was about how they dressed. Like, hey, I wear things that are, a bit funky, and do people think that's cool, or do they think I'm weird? And for others, it was about, how much of their kind of personal choices could they bring into the workplace? So, one person talked about how, he lives quite an alternative lifestyle, and he would talk to people about that at work and kind of gauge how they responded. And that was his test to see, well, can I go a bit deeper here, or do I need to back away and kind of put the mask on a little bit? So that's the unveiled self. The seen self is that piece I mentioned around recognition, and are we being recognized for the things that really matter to us and not just the things that matter to the organization? So am I seen for my own values, what's most important to me, and the skills that I think are critical? And then the relational self, can I be me with you? This is more of that, the human aspect. So I heard lots of stories from people around, when I sit down to talk to my boss, she asks me about my kids. She knows their names and she knows what I'm going through at the moment. And she sees me as a human being and not just an employee. Also, hearing stories on the opposite side of that, like, I'm just a butt in a chair and I feel very replaceable, and the only thing that people see is, the work that I produce. So it's that sense of, am I a human being who's recognized as a human being, or am I just kind of filling the need for this organization? So that's it in a very brief nutshell. Sure.
Kia ora, Natasha. You said that if someone identified as lonely, that was equivalent as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Super curious as to the biological or physiological markers that you tracked in those that identified as lonely and how you saw those deteriorate.
Yeah. So just to be clear, that wasn't my research, but there is a lot of research out there around the physiological impact. And so a lot of that comes from things like, I mentioned blood pressure and poor sleep. And we know that stress as a whole obviously has an impact on us physiologically. And so the impact of stress and the impact of loneliness are, quite similar in terms of how they impact on the body. So that's that's kind of the extent of what I can tell you in the research that I did. But if you do a Google on the 15 cigarettes a day, and it will lead you to the articles that talk more about that. Other questions?
We'll take one more. Anyone in the back who wanted one? Oh, we'll do it over here. Sorry.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for your talk. I was just wondering, is there any research on, for example, people who grew up in a family where both parents are from a different country, different culture, speak a different language, and them not really feeling like they belong anywhere, and how they can find a sense of belongingness?
Yeah, there is. It wasn't the particular focus of my research, but there is some really interesting literature about that. Those people who feel in between cultures, the same often with people of mixed ethnicities. I don't belong in this group. I don't belong in that group. And so, where do I belong? And so, I haven't read much in terms of strategies for what those folks can do, but there is a lot around the impact that has, and usually that starts at school age and kind of continues all the way through into the workplace. Often what we find, because there's some really interesting research around friendship, and so a lot of that research talks about how in adulthood our expectations and the way that we look at belongingness starts to change. So in childhood, it often is more about fitting in. So am I enough like other people that I can find a place of belonging here? As an adult, it starts to become more about, can I be recognized for my uniqueness? So can I be my weird, quirky self and still find others who are going to respond to that? That tends to be more where we find our sense of belonging. So you think about groups that form around, we all love hiking, or we all go to nerd night together. Those kinds of things tend to be where we find that common ground in adulthood. So I think, from my limited knowledge of the research around people who are in those kind of in-between spaces, that's often what the research points to is, it comes to finding people who share those similar kinds of quirks or unique traits is where that sense of belonging comes from.
Thank you so much. Let's give Natasha another round of applause.